Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me on this live stream masterclass and discussion on information management in social housing. So I want to start by just taking us through what we're going to be covering today. We're going to so firstly, you might be just wondering about that intro. So the intro, it feels a bit different, doesn't it? But it's really there to get us thinking about the extent of the digital and cyber world. It's very easy to lose track of quite how prevalent digital and data and cyber is in everything that we do these days. It's at work, in the computers and the software that we use. It's at home, and it's also in the devices that we use. And so easy to lose track of that. All that information whizzing around inside our computers, in the internet, to the cloud, even in the radio waves around us. And I think that's really a key message about today's masterclass, really recognizing the significance of digital and cyber and making sure that our organizational cultures are adapted to that. So what are we going to be covering today? Well, we're going to kick the live stream off by looking at the perfect storm which the social housing sector is currently going through, and then why, for that reason, good information management within housing providers has never been so important. And actually, it's not just about the social housing sector. Over Christmas, I was speaking with relatives, and they were telling me that it's the same sorts of issues taking place in the medical sector, also in the charity sector, and also more broadly across the digital sector. This is just what we're facing in social housing, is just how that rapid evolution of digital tech is expressing itself here, but it's actually right across the economy. So once we've finished talking about the perfect storm, I'm going to pop up some animated slides to explain to you how digital systems have changed the way the sector operates and the new challenges that have come with this. Then we'll move on to the most important part of the masterclass, which is the solution, which I'm proposing today is those core concepts of building information management, BIM, which, if implemented, will allow the social housing sector to truly become a 21st century digitally enabled organizations and achieve game-changing performance improvements. This is very much about changing the way we think day to day to a new, more modern way of thinking. And then it's about empowering our organizations so that this becomes instinctive in everything that they do. It's about culture shift and reshaping our organizations to think differently. And believe you me, this is quite conceptual. It's quite challenging information, and this is a masterclass, so there is some learning in there. I do want to keep you engaged and with me. I'll be presenting ideas for around 50 minutes. We'll have a brief pause midway to see if there's any clarifying questions. But as I say, these are strategic, intangible concepts. But the idea is that you can learn them today in this masterclass, and those will be the seeds that you can take to your organizations and plant to really shape the way your organizations are working collectively. And hopefully the masterclass will help you to see your organizations in a different light, a more modern light. And a final point is that there is a lot of procedural detail around these key concepts, but today we don't have time to cover those. We're just going to be dealing with those key concepts. Before we do get on with the actual masterclass, though, I think it's appropriate to do some introductions. It's not just me today. We do have some special guests with us who I'll be introducing in a moment. In terms of myself, my name is Edward Carpenter. Many years ago, I was responsible for navigating ships in the Royal Navy, where information management and accuracy was absolutely critical to the safety of everything that happened on the ship. Since then, for 11 years, I've had a career across corporate services in social housing, where I have implemented data protection frameworks. I've insured billions of pounds worth of property, which is an increasingly data heavy activity. I've overseen and quality controlled key data returns for the regulator of social housing, and I've chaired data governance groups and led numerous data projects. In 2023, I successfully completed the training and exam to become BIM ISO 19650 practitioner qualified. That's the standard for BIM. And I'm currently group head of corporate compliance and assurance at Riverside. Today, however, I'm speaking in a personal capacity. And all of the above has given me profound insight into the challenges and the solutions for information management in social housing. Now, joining me today, I have Neil Topping, who is one of our two special guests. Neil is a director of Data Futurist, a business which is focused on enabling housing providers to be better data-driven organizations. And he's also co-founder of Para DPO, a business which provides data protection as a service. Neil is also a board member of the Bedford Citizens Housing Association. So it's true to say that Neil has both data and housing running through his veins. And I've had the pleasure of working with Neil on projects such as property hierarchies, property ownership records, asset inventories, and social housing data standards. Neil, thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Michael O'Flaherty is our second special guest in the studio today. Michael has been working in building fire safety for 15 years and is also a qualified building surveyor. His current role is Group Head of Fire Safety Management and Surveying at the Riverside Group, where he leads a team of in-house fire safety professionals who conduct fire risk assessments, fire door inspections and FRA validations for over 3,500 properties UK-wide. He's also responsible for creating and implementing all fire-related policies, procedures and management plans at Riverside. And in his spare time, Michael is also pursuing a doctorate in business administration around these kinds of subjects. When the main masterclass is over, Neil and Michael are going to provide a short response from their perspective on BIM and information management in social housing, and then they will help respond to questions and comments that have come in over the LinkedIn comments channel. So once again, thank you both for joining us today and helping me with this event. We're almost at the start point, but a few more things. Firstly, what's the approach of today? Well, this is live stream, so that means you can all see us, but we can't see you. However, we can see your comments and questions, which you can put into the comments and chat thread, which should either be to the right or beneath this video. And as I say, Michael will kindly be moderating and look at your comments as they come in. There will be a pause if there's any clarification about midway. But otherwise, once our guests have given us their response, we'll then get on to answering your questions and a discussion around this subject. And there should be about 30 minutes for that. So it'll be speaking for about 50 minutes and then, as I say, 30 minutes for questions and discussion. Now, Neil also gave me the idea of doing a poll. A nice way to get a little bit of engagement, make our engagement with you a little bit more scientific, find out a bit more about you and find a bit more about the sector as a whole from all of you who are joining us today. So, Neil, if you could drop the first poll question into the channel, this will appear in the comments. What I suggest you do is that you right click and open that poll in a separate tab. It is a LinkedIn poll. It won't show, it's a public poll, but it won't show your name, but it will sort of show the outcome of the overall poll. The question is, what engagement do you or your organization have with the social housing sector? So the answers are, I work in social housing, I'm a supplier or potential supplier to the social housing sector, I have a stake and an interest in social housing, or my sector has similar issues to the social housing sector. And then, Neil, if you could go ahead and put the second polling question in. In your experience, how effectively do you feel the social housing sector is at digital information management? And the possible answers here are fully embraced and exploiting, making strong progress, sort of they're on the right path and getting there, just starting to grip the challenge, so we sort of understand it's serious, and we're going to start getting into it, or barely scratch the surface, not even recognizing how important this is and just way off the mark. So if you could get both of those in there for me, Neil, that would be great. And also, just as I am about to launch into the start of the masterclass, it would also be great for you to tell us who you are in the comments, where you work, and what your interest is in social housing to get a little bit of two-way engagement going. So, without further ado, we will move on to the second part, or sort of the real start of this, which is the perfect storm that we find ourselves in now. So I'm just going to get the slides up on the screen. Let's have a look now. Here we go. There we go. So the social housing, the national population of UK is growing. And at the same time, the social housing stock has been shrinking. So since 1980, stock was at 5.5 million, but today that's down at 4.1 million. And most people in the UK are very aware that house prices are at record highs and home ownership is simply becoming unaffordable for many people within the UK, and even renting is becoming unaffordable. For years and years now, the UK government has been promising a surge in building to try and address this shortfall, but it simply never met the scale of the challenge that's needed. And this has led to the Labour government, the new Labour government, pledging to build 1.5 million new homes by the end of the Parliament, although it's widely considered that the UK doesn't have the capacity for that presently. But it's not just about numbers. Grenfell, the terrible tragedy 7.5 years ago, led to a horrendous death for 72 residents who lost their lives. And then 5 years ago, we had the death of Awab Ishaq. And both those tragedies have sent shockwaves around the social housing sector, I would say the housing sector more broadly, but also related sectors such as construction, insurance, and so on. And also, there is a need for the UK's 27 million housing stock to be prepared for net zero and to be resilient to the changing climate. The climate has already changed. This isn't a thing of tomorrow. We're already suffering from extreme weather events. And what all of these things point to is that the UK housing stock really isn't fit for purpose as it currently is. And the UK is known for having old, leaky, and poor quality homes. So there's not enough homes. What we do have is not of good enough quality. There is a huge need for investment. However, after years of cutting back on funding for new homes, we've also had the impact of COVID, which has driven up costs across the sector, particularly in relation to repairs. And then the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which led to spiraling inflation, spiraling interest rates, and the government then, to protect tenants, quite rightly, putting rent controls on the social housing sector. And this has made the financial conditions for the social housing sector tighter than ever. And it's quite clear from the most recent budget that there actually isn't a lot of money coming our way yet. So, my goodness, you all came here to find out about information management. But what does this mean? We need more cash. We've got a crisis. We need cash to sort it out. We need investment. There isn't that money available. So we're going to have to do more with less. And that points to efficiency and productivity improvements. And there are some other opportunities to talk about and changes. First of all, the social housing sector has significantly been consolidating over the last 45 years. So in 1980, there were over 400,000 social housing providers. Today, though, there's only 1,600. And what we're finding is that on average, social housing providers have got their stock size has increased by over 180 times. So we are managing many more properties. And on top of that, we are seeing a substantial increase in regulation, largely in response to those terrible tragedies, and also to, for example, the demands for the transition to net zero, and even the need to protect our biodiversity. So we're managing more information than ever before. And on top of that, we're needing to know much more about our homes. So much more information is needed. So how are we going to deal with that? Well, there has been the introduction over that same period of computers and digital systems. This has been evolving very rapidly, and certainly software developers would have us believe that this can answer all our solutions. So the digital world is hopefully riding to the rescue here. However, our tried and tested organizational tools and approaches so far have just got stuck. And it really is fairly clear through things that have been coming out from the regulatory sector that we're just not managing to grip the new world of digital information management. It's just not working yet. Finally, I just want to point to something that's worth thinking about. So it's the intergenerational differences between us. So when I first started my career, computers were still pretty early in being used in work. There wasn't much specialist software. However, that's been increasing over time. But younger members in the economy and in social housing sector, they will have been brought up in a much more tech-savvy environment, potentially using digital devices, iPads and things like that, right from almost being toddlers. And I think it's really worth thinking about that. Where is the knowledge? Where is that natural ability? Where are the skills that we need? And where isn't it? And where are the decisions being made? So where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges across our workforce within the same organization? So that's really the picture that I wanted to paint before moving on to the detail of the masterclass. So housing crisis, need for investment, lack of money. We need to become more efficient. We have the promise of the digital revolution, but we haven't quite got it right. How can we get it right? I'm just going to take a quick pause before I move on, just to make sure everything's okay. Mike, is everything looking okay from your end through the moderation side of things?
Yeah, I can see comments coming in. So any questions, pop them in here and I'll star them. We can come back to them later.
Absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to crack on with the second part of this this masterclass, and this is how have digital systems changed the way that the sector functions, and what are the new challenges that they have brought with them. Whilst this isn't the concept of BIM, I think it's really helpful to actually understand what's going on, because when you understand what's going on, it really helps you explain and understand why BIM is so important. So certainly from a corporate compliance perspective, I'm very much looking at the tools that organizations use to deliver organization. Organizations are supposed to be organized. So how do we organize? How do we deliver? So the first thing we have is a corporate strategy. That's that seminal document at the top of the organization, examines the external environment, identifies where the business is today, and identifies where it wants to get to within 3 to 5 years. It looks at the resources and the challenges and the approach it's going to take to do that. And underneath that, you then have further strategies. So I'm just going to just make it a bit easier for you to see. You have further, more detailed strategies. These might be related to development of properties. It might be your people strategy. It might even be, you might even have a digital or a change strategy. Again, it's all about change. Underneath that, you then have your policies. This is really setting out what your responsibilities are and your duties, how you're going to meet them, how you aim to deliver on your responsibilities and duties through your day-to-day service provision. And underneath your policies, you have your procedures. So that's even more granular, but this is really your step-by-step how to actually deliver aspects of your services. It has responsibilities in it at a sort of person level or a role level, and it should also be really making clear what the business rules are that we have to adhere to. So these are the tried and tested tools that we've been relying on now for generations. Very much people orientated. They're written on pieces of paper, PDFs these days, but really that's the equivalent of a piece of paper. And they're very much, as I say, orientated to the human. And information in those days initially would have been all in filing cabinets. That's where everything would have been stored. But we've moved on and we now have computers. And with computers, we've got now 2 more layers in our layer cake that we need to consider. The first one is data flows. So when we go to a computer and we tap something in, that information flows around potentially just within the computer, or it's going to fly off to a server if it's at work, or it might fly off to the cloud, into the internet. Information is flowing around. It may come back to you. It may go back to another colleague, another organization. So that information is flowing around. We can't see it, but that's what it's doing. The final layer is the data elements. Now, these are the little parcels of information that comprise those data flows. So some examples here would be the name, the first name of a customer or of a colleague, or the last name, or it might be the street number of a property. It might be the floor number of the property. It might be the rent or the service charge. There's a whole host of things, but it's those little granular particles that can't be broken down of information that then are doing all the flows around our various systems. And all of this, of course, has to comply with law and legislation. And one thing I'd like us to think about is, if we were still relying on filing cabinets, would we really be able to store all the information and manipulate the information that we rely on today? Just imagine, my organization manages 75,000 homes, owns 75,000 homes. How on earth would we keep all of that in filing cabinets? And so we have actually become incredibly dependent upon these digital systems and storage systems. And I think that's important to consider, how much IT and digital systems have actually shaped the housing sector as it is today, and the importance that they play in that. Today, we're going to strip away the change bits, and we're going to strip away the policy, because in general, housing associations get the policy fairly well. And we're going to look at the procedure and those new computer-based levels. Now, 40 years ago, all those procedures were manual. There you go. There's a manual procedure. So again, it was step 1, step 2, step 3, and it was a human reading the step, taking it to the next person, giving it to the next person, sending it off to that organization, all very manual and people powered. But what we've seen is the introduction of computers. Now, originally, these were relatively simple systems, standalone, not interconnected. So you might go up to your computer, it might be an access database or something like that. You tap away into it. You might print something out and then take it to your next team, or just read it or whatever, or just access it. But it wasn't interconnected. These were standalone systems. And so the data flows there on the data flow level were relatively short. But what we've seen over recent years is those computers become more powerful, more sophisticated, purpose-based software, which can do more and more for us. Until eventually today, they're really doing a huge amount of those manual processes. More and more of those processes have become ingested into digital software, digital systems, and those systems are even interconnected now. And I just want to have another pause, because I think it's very easy to forget how significant this is. The amount of stuff that's happening in computers and systems, we don't see it. It's behind the scenes. We tap at the computer, but we don't see this stuff happening. And actually, our organizations have almost become hollowed out the core of it is all digital based, and the human now is more at the periphery. We're at the input, we're at the output, we're at the monitoring, and we're at the design. And I just think that's really important to consider how significant that change has been and how aware we are of it. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to strip away the procedure aspect, and we're going to look in more detail at the actual data flows. So these data flows are now really substantial. With no intervention from humans, they can really cross the entirety of a group. And Riverside, for example, reaches from Scotland all the way down to Kent. And these flows can happen right across that space. Now, they don't necessarily all happen instantaneously. Some of them might, but you can almost imagine like going to work. There might be some traffic lights to get through. And it might even be that you sort of the information parks up on the way and spends a few days or even a few years sat there. And then something happens and then the information goes to the next step. So these flows can be stretched out over time. And they cross over different systems now. So information can start from one system, go into another one through APIs and integrations. And this is all outside of the vision of human beings. It's happening invisibly. So let's see how this actually is manifesting itself in a social housing provider. So let's imagine those little group of circles is our development team, the different teams within the development team. And let's say the development director is trying to build a new scheme. And he's thinking, or she's thinking about the height of a property. And he's thinking, right, I'm going to build that from ground level to roof level. That's what I mean by height when I'm talking about the height of my scheme. She goes on, they build their homes, and then they hand them over to the operations team. And the compliance team going, right, we need to make sure these properties are safe and compliant with the new Building Safety Act. We need to make sure that we've registered them, for example, if they're tall buildings, and we need to now register them because of the Building Safety Act. So for us, height is from the basement to the highest projectile on the roof. That's what I mean from height. Thank you, development team, for giving me that height value. Now on to the finance and the marketing team. And marketing team are saying, right, I want to put a customer into this property. Thank you. I've got the height here. This is the height of the flat above ground level. Customer, are you happy with that? And then on the information goes further on in its flow off to the insurance team, and the insurance team is trying to negotiate with the insurer how many tall buildings it's got and where it's got to pay an additional premium because of the height of the buildings. So development think they've got apples, operations think they've got oranges, finance and insurance thinks they're working with plums, where they've actually all got lemons. They've all got different interpretations. They think they've got the right figure, but they actually haven't. And the risk with that is that once you've got the wrong information in your systems, in your operational systems, it's called upon, it's being accessed all the time by your customer relationship management models, by your finance models. And so that error is going to be repeated hundreds and hundreds of times. Now, there is a way around this, and the way around that is to really get disciplined about data elements. We need to be specific and granular. And there is actually a process and a standard which talks what we call about master data management, where you have to define each data element very carefully. So this might be height, basement to uppermost projectile, height of apartment, height for tall buildings. And each of those are separate data elements and are defined separately. You'll set out where the master record is, that where's the single version of the truth that I can be sure I'm getting the right version. If I've got a problem and I think this information is missing or it might be incorrect, who's the person I go to? It needs a defined data owner. Are there some automated anomaly reports associated with this, and so on? All of that needs to be tied down. And if we can do that, we can end up with, a solid data quality, one version of the truth. And these sort of rules are set out in ISO 8000, which is called the data quality standard. And some housing associations are sort of dabbling with this now. They know, some might be more ahead, but many are just sort of really waking up to the scale of the challenge here. So that's where we are now. And the thing is, I think even with ISO 8000, we still have a challenge. Because in an organization with a large number of employees, so for example, Riverside has got approximately 4,000 employees, and they actually don't know that those layers exist. They know the computer exists because they tap away at the computer. They see the form, they see the software they're working on. They don't know where it goes. They access the information, but they don't really know where it goes. And I don't know about the organizations where you folks work, but my experience as a compliance individual professional is that actually often those procedures aren't in place either. And social housing providers are really complex. They've got lots of complicated services, and not having clear processes that navigate that complexity and set out the business rules and responsibilities make things even more difficult. And the result is what I call the Badlands. So it's where information is being tapped into all these computers, but it's piling up in unstructured piles without people really knowing what's going on. It's very unruly. People are a little bit getting up to whatever they want to. And all of this is under the radar. Execs are blissfully unaware until, bam, a major controls failure is finally identified. Potentially, the regulators flagged issues with rent charges, for example, and we've gone in and we've just found, oh no, there's 2,000 tenants who've been overcharged for the last 2 years, and it's a big unfurling, a big explosion right up to the exec, right up to the attention of the board. Internal auditors are brought in to sort it out. Resources have to be mustered to fix the problem. Often there's backlogs, money has to be repaid, and potentially the organisation gets downgraded. So that's one major challenge. The other thing is that some employees are more data savvy. However, dabbling with data flows and data elements is definitely beyond their comfort zone. They know Microsoft, they know SharePoint, but that's about where they keep things. But that's all right, because they've got a wonderful BI and information governance team. They've got a set of data engineers who are there to help them out. So off they go with all their queries to get help and get those reports made and get the bits and bobs tidied up that they need. But my goodness, these small teams are quickly overloaded with the burden and just unable to meet the demand. However, we also have our PMO team. And so those are bravely deployed to go and help out with all the challenges that we've got. So, for example, they might have a big program to introduce the next customer relationship management system or the next housing system. And they may well have some success, and some employees are now really able to use those couple of systems really well now. But the reality is that the level of change needed is just too much. And there's a tidal wave of change, and they can just never keep up. It only takes a merger for you then to have to work out how to combine all the different systems from the different housing associations. And potentially by the time you've updated the CRM or the housing system, you have to, replace your operating system. You might have to move to a new version of Windows or introduce SharePoint. And it's a little bit like, as we say in England, painting the fourth bridge. It's never finished, and there's never the capacity to really get to where we want to be. And what I'm proposing to you today is that the solution to all of this is to adopt a BIM culture, to empower our colleagues to really engage with data flows and data elements in terms that they understand, and importantly, to put the home at the heart of everything that we do. And the great news is that BIM, Building Information Management, ISO 19650, gives us those concepts and processes on how to do that. So I'm just going to take a little pause there, and I'm just going to bring Mike in. Mike, we're about halfway through the presentation now. Are there any questions for clarification before we go on to the second part of the masterclass?
Yeah, there's one question and then sort of one discussion point. So Chris Gunton's put in, An interesting question here. Is there an opportunity for AI deployment in BIM, sort of at unit block or even wider estate management? So they're looking at AI to support a new ground source heat plant for a new building in Kings Lynn. So I think sort of the discussion point of, will we be able to attach AI to that BIM system, and what do we think it will do?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that would be a good one for Neil, Mike, and myself. We should pick that up at the end. What I would say as a sort of intermediary comment, though, Chris, is that I think unless we get the basic data right in our systems, AI is going to be a little bit fishing around. You know the expression "rubbish in, rubbish out." So I think when it comes to our core system that we rely on, we still need to make sure that's properly structured, because the AI is going to be wanting to call upon that information. I think there is a role for AI. It may be we can help use AI to help unpick some of the tangle that we're in. But fundamentally, within our housing organisation, our core systems, we need to get properly structured data before we can really move forward with the enormous opportunity that AI offers us. However, let's pick that up in a little bit more detail, because I can imagine, certainly Neil, possibly Mike, there's something more that you'd want to say on that. Any more clarifications, Mike, before we go on with the last part of the presentation?
Just another point from Chris, so sort of stating, interoperability of systems is key, or the benefits of having a one system does all. So I think that's a good point. And as you mentioned previously, we've gone through a major merger, and it kind of puts lots of things on hold while there's an IT sort of discussion, which could be multiple years, where you can't integrate while they're discussing which system we're going to pick. Are we going to change systems altogether? And you get stuck in a bit of a holding pattern where you're trying to, can we do that one system? Can we link these together?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really useful time to actually just quickly mention this before we move on. So thanks for that, Chris. Because BIM, the concept of BIM, which we're going to go over now, is often misconstrued. People take away one element or the other element from it, and it means different things to different people. And one misconception of BIM is that it's a really fancy piece of software. And I think that's largely because BIM, the birthplace of BIM, as far as I understand, has been in the development sector, in building properties, where you would have 3D CAD models, and then we just strapped more and more onto that, and it was all within one piece of software. But the BIM standard is not about one piece of software. It's about wherever your information is, that it's federated, it's knitted together to work collectively to give you one reliable single version of the truth, which they call a common data environment. And we're going to go into that. So Mike, if that's it, I'm going to bring up the slides again. And we will carry on with the last part of the presentation, which is the most important bit, of course, which is those key concepts of building infra management. I'm really hoping that I'm going to give you folks the seeds or the ideas to take away and empower information management in your work and your organizations. So here we go. So the concept of BIM, the vision of BIM, encapsulates all these different things, 5 of them there. And I remember when I sat down with a past CIO of mine, and we sat down during an intro talk and spoke about how do our organizations function. And what was said at the time was, and I sort of agreed really, was it's about people, it's about process, and it's about tech. Well, that's only 3 things. You can see we've got 5 here. And I think the most important thing to take away here is that tech and data are separate. And actually, I think AI is going to make tech less and less relevant and put more and more weight on the data. But what BIM is saying is that to get a really collaborative organization that is collectively working effectively with information, you need to get all 5 of those working correctly. Many organizations have got 1 or 2 of those functioning correctly, but you need them all working, and you need the right balance between them. And if you can do that, you will get that BIM culture. For me, BIM is a culture. It's a way of behaving, a way of working, a way of thinking and seeing things. And the good news is that BIM aligns with all these things which are very relevant to the social housing sector. The Housing Ombudsman, which has got increased regulatory powers these days, put out a report, I think it was last year, called Knowledge Information Management, really looking for improvement in how the social housing sector does that. BIM delivers there. In fact, you've even got the Kim BIM thing going on, which makes me think they were half thinking BIM when they were talking about it. There's the new regulatory consumer standards from the regulator that were launched last April, which now require a much better understanding of one's housing stock and also a much better understanding of our customers, more data, and then making sure that we're understanding how our homes are actually delivering for the needs of our customers. So BIM is aligned to that as well. The National Housing Federation Code of Governance requires us to be able to grasp our information. And the regulatory standard on value for money needs us to be efficient and effective. And information management, I think, currently is a great, it's holding us back. It's a constraint on efficiency. And so BIM offers an opportunity to improve value for money. And also BIM aligns with the lean project change methodology. And then finally, anyone who's aware of the net zero transition, what that means for built assets, is probably aware that we need to understand a lot more about our homes. We need to sort of pre-design them and think about how they're going to be thermally efficient. We need to think about how they're going to be angled towards the sun, how that's going to heat them up. And then there's also going to be much more compliance for quality control when we build new homes. But then also for retrofitting, we need to understand more about our homes. So BIM is really giving us the tools to answer all of these key requirements. But what we've seen, and again, I'm just harping back a little bit here to the problem, is that lots of organizations launch projects, many projects that are information related. However, they're not really joined up. They haven't really grasped that actually the big picture here is BIM. And actually, it's that joined up culture and how do we pull it together so we've got that one collective version and culture that's working for the whole of the organization. So that's the BIM vision. And now we're going to look at the first key concept. Okay, there are 4 key concepts that I want to explain to you today. So the first one here is understanding the life cycle of our assets. So on the left there, let me just move myself out of the way. On the left there is the twinkle in the eye of the development director. I've got to build a scheme. So I'm going to build a scheme. That's all I know. This many units in this location. So he then has to go, he or she, I should say, has to go through a process of working up those plans. And it's interesting, I don't know if anyone here has seen it, but there's a thing called the RIBA Schedule of Works, which is a fairly widely accepted standard for the building, the planning and the building of properties. Very, very structured, really helpful tool. And it's a very structured process. And what you can see in that left-hand part of the screen is this rapid growth of information as that design process and build process is happening. So to start with, I'm just building potentially 40 units. Now I know whether they're going to be flats or homes. I know if they're going to where their windows are going to be. Oh, now I've gone through the phase of working out the wiring, whether they're going to have lifts, what sort of windows. And you can see that information growth growing rapidly, but in that lovely staged process along the bottom, and that amount of information rapidly growing. And that lighter green is there to demonstrate its project. It's a project, it's build, it's change. Now, this is a really, really, really important interface. This is where the properties have been built and they're now being handed over to operations to actually put people inside the homes. It's that handover. And what you see on the other side then is the slightly darker green. So this is your BAU stand. This is the information that sits in our housing system. It's not changing. It's got this many homes. This is the address, etc., etc. It's the standard information that's not changing. But you can see a little bit of light green there. There's a little bit of project work that does keep going. And it's that project work which is leading to this more gradual growth in quantity of information. And that's because things do happen throughout the life of an asset. It might be that we want to extend them. It might be, and this is something very relevant to Mike, we might want to go and fit new fire doors to them. That's going to be a new project. There's going to be new information related to that. It might be that we need to revalue the properties or risk assess them. So there will be growth in information over time. And it's not structured anymore. It's not this lovely structured approach. It's much more based on certain triggers. Certain thing happens and it triggers the need for a project. And so that's the nature of that information growth, all the way up to the point that you're actually selling or disposing of that property. Now, one of the, I jumped forward. One of the issues is that you often find that this information handover doesn't happen. And actually, there's a big jump downwards and a sort of discontinuity. And that's where development simply haven't handed over the information that's needed for the operations team to fully operate their assets. And what happens is that operations are forever chasing their tails for the information that they need. So that's the concept of life cycle. So now we know that we're going to have to consider the life cycle of our asset, and just think how long an asset lasts from build. A building could be up for tens of years, if not 100 years. Hopefully that will be the case. And as we've explored through that concept of the life cycle, many different people are going to engage and need to have information related to that asset to fulfill their responsibility. So let's just look at that. BIM's got this concept of information perspective. So the asset owner, so let's imagine the board here and the chief executive. They need to know how many homes they've got, where are they located. They need to know what amount of profit their homes are making. Do their homes comply with the law? And what's the overall satisfaction with their homes? That's the owner's perspective. Now, think about all the teams that support that asset management, building safety. To be able to give the CEO and the board what they need to know a lot more granular information about the asset. Is there asbestos? Is there electrical fittings in there? How many rooms are there? Are there fire doors fitted? Is this disability friendly or not? So the asset owners need to know a heck of a lot more information. What's the value? It's not just physical aspects. What's the rent set against this property? Then there's the project perspective. These are the teams and the people who are building the new homes. So it's like, what's the goal here? What's my budget, etc. That's the project set. And then there's society more widely. So what's our reputation? Is there a sense that all these properties are actually safe to move into? What are our expectations of this housing organisation and the properties that it has? So lots of different perspectives to consider. And if you imagine, we actually need processes that actually consider what people's needs are at the beginning. As we're creating that information, we need to think, right, well, who's going to need it? Whose perspective are we collecting information for? And we capturing that information for? So you then get to this point. You know now that you need to get a heck of a lot of information to properly be able to operate your assets. So you've got a specification. You've specified this is the information that I'm going to need so that this organisation can manage its homes effectively. Right, well, how are we going to get that? Where's that information come from? Who's going to provide us with that information? Where's that information going to go once I've got it? It's not going in a filing cabinet. It's got to go somewhere in a digital system. So we've then got to plan for the delivery of that information. And then we need to go through to the actual delivery of that information. So as the project is delivered, that information needs to be produced and prepared for handing over. So that really is a critical considerations. And I'm now going to show you a diagram which shows you how all of this stitches together. And this is a process that we need to make fundamental in how our organizations operate. So there's the board, there's the CEO, this is what they need. There are our organizational information requirements. It's what the organization needs. Based on that, these are the asset-related information requirements, the more detailed aspect. Now that we know, we've broken down, we've said, right, the organization needs this, we've gone through a process to work out at the asset level, then this is what we need. We know all the information that we need now. Let's now make sure we've actually got somewhere to put that information. And so we have our asset information model. This is sort of touching a little bit on Chris's question, does this go in one piece of software or does it go in numerous pieces of software? It doesn't really matter. It just has to go somewhere, and we have to have a blueprint for how we keep all of our asset information to make sure we've got everything that we need. And that's what we call our asset information model. Now, we have the projects that kick off, the building of the house or the fitting of fire doors. So the organization tasks off a project team. I want you to go forward and build a scheme of 40 properties, or I want you to go and fit fire doors. Here's your task, here's your budget. The project team then needs to understand, well, okay, that's very outlined, that objective. I now need to understand at a more granular level what information I need. It has exchanges with the asset teams and works out in much greater detail what information is required for it to deliver the project. As the project progresses, that information is collected. So let's imagine Mike is fitting 3,500 fire doors. Okay, so what are the properties that he's fitted them in? What type of fire door was fitted? Which door of the property was it fitted in? What was the when was the last inspection done on that fire door? When will the next one be done? And have the customers been informed? So a heck of a lot of information will be gathered during that project, and that is called the project information model. And this is where things so often fall down. That project information isn't then added to the asset information model, and therefore the business is left in a deficit and doesn't have the information it needs to manage that asset going forward. So let's just look at the old layer cake and see what's happening in the old way of looking at things. So along the top there, this is what the organization needs. This is how we fulfill our responsibilities in our processes and our policies. And from there, this is the information that we're going to need in our asset information model to deliver our services and procedures. Now we need to deliver change. So we're talking strategy. So we're going to do something differently. We're going to increase the number of homes. We're going to fit fire doors. And so there may be a need for new data elements in our asset information model. And so that's going to be needed to be added. And this cycle happens time and time again. This is the critical cycle that we have to build into our businesses, into our organizations. So whenever there is a project, no matter how small it may seem, and here up on the screen is a list of triggers that the BIM standard actually quotes. Take a look through. You will recognize, many of you will recognize these types of process: asset replacement, new asset, change of ownership, risk assessment. These are all things that are happening every day in a housing organization, and they need to be seen as triggering a project. What does the project need to do? What are the information requirements? Getting those information requirements from the asset information teams, gathering that information, and then making sure it's added to the asset information model. And we've got to have like a highway in our business where this feels absolutely instinctive. So that's the second concept I wanted to get to you. Now, the third concept, and this is about information exchange. So we've looked at the life cycle. We've looked at all the different people that are involved in information over the life cycle. Now, I did mention that BIM was originally coming from the sort of development side, the building of homes. And this diagram particularly demonstrates that in a way where the housing provider or the purchaser, the purchaser of the new homes is at the center, and then has a lead contractor who's going to build those homes for you. The lead contractor might have some subcontractors who may have subcontractors, and there may be a few other contractors involved in getting those homes built. But whether it's building new homes or actually just the teams within an organization that's going to fit the fire doors, for example, there is going to be a lot of exchanging of information. We've developed our specification. So this is the information we need. We've done our analysis of the OIRs and the AIRs, the asset information requirements. There's our spec. This is what we're going to need, lead contractor. This is what we're going to need, fire safety team. Off you go. And then as the project progresses, the information is exchanged with us, and we need to make sure that that really high risk scenario, because this is where it goes wrong, is where we don't get what was specified. It's not it's not correctly handed over, it was ill-defined, or it wasn't handed over, or it's corrupted, or it doesn't work in our systems. And this is where there needs to be checks. So the party that's about to do the exchange needs to have a set of systematic checks. The information is handed over, it's exchanged, and once we receive it on the other side, we also have to do our checks. And this way, we take the risk out of exchanging information. And if we just take a little pause now, if we think about what's happening in an organization and the problems that we face, it is all about the exchange of information, isn't it? It's about collaboration, and collaboration is about information being handed between people. And so this really is a fundamental part of protecting our data quality and the integrity of our information. On to the fourth and final key concept of BIM. And this is about the common data environment. And as we've said, we've got our specification. Information needs to be worked up, and you'll have individual teams doing this. They might be doing it on their own little piece of software. They might be doing it on an Excel spreadsheet. Who knows? But once they do that, it needs to be handed over, and there needs to be deconfliction to make sure it actually meets the expectation of all those other parties that have got a stake in it, to make sure that there's no conflict and this actually meets the requirements. So before those individual teams hand that information over, we need some thorough checks before it goes public to make sure the right information is being handed over. That goes into the shared space. That deconfliction process happens. Any conflicts are sorted out. There might be some iterations of new data. And then, right, we're ready to go and publish. Now, publishing, if you're building a house or a home or a scheme, publishing might be publishing to a contract, actually getting the contract out. So large amounts of money and legal terms being set out. If you're fitting the fire doors and you're in the operational side of the business, then this might be putting the data into your core operating system. Once it's out there, it's in the core operating system, anybody could be calling on that data, it's published, it needs to be right. And so you want some governance checks there as well to make sure it's absolutely right before going live and making that big investment and that big step. And the idea is that if you do that, you have the integrity, you maintain the integrity of the flow of your data around your organization. And the archive there is for those iterative steps to sort of be able to evidence the conversations and the responsibilities that have been exercised throughout those iterations of data. Now, that's the concept, but actually, how do we deliver it? Well, what it talks about, all these little bits of information, the BIM standard calls them containers. So it goes right down to the most granular layer. It might be, what tap are you going to be fitting in this property, or what fire door. It's absolutely granular, but then it builds up. So it might be, what home is it, or what scheme is it, or what estate is it? But everything has got its container and is defined. It's got like its own address, so we know where everything is stored. The second thing we do is we rely on the federation strategy. Now, this is what knits it all together. Now, if you've got a smart piece of software, I think that'd be more in the development world, really, rather than social housing. It might do it for you. But in the operations side, in social housing, where we've got lots of different digital platforms working for us, we have to deal with what we've got. And the reality is that we've got many different systems and they need to work together. So this federation strategy is those processes and rules that we need to abide to make sure things are moving around the business correctly. Now, that can happen manually. For many of us, as we start our journey, it's going to be a manual process, but that can still be specified in a process. And hopefully, as our data engineers get their way, they will automate these processes for us. But just whether it's a computer or a human, there needs to be clear steps, clear processes, and clear rules abided by. So that's a great important piece of work there that enables our information to be part of that common data environment, or the CDE as they call it. And the good news is that there are data standards that help us with much of this, particularly with the containerization of information. Now, in the development world, there are national standards for how you break a home down into the various different bits and pieces. But what's really interesting, and I'm hoping Neil's going to touch on this a bit later, is that actually there is work underway to develop social housing standards. So we don't always have to define all these containers and data elements ourselves. We can actually call upon a standard. And Chris, you were talking about interoperability. I'm hoping that these data standards will actually enable social housing providers. They'll all be working on the same definitions. And so we'll be able to work with other social housing providers. We'll be able to work with contractors. It will really take a lot of the pain out of collaborative working. So what I'm suggesting then is that those 4 concepts will create the vision, and that with these concepts that use people-friendly terms will take away those barriers, and they will empower our colleagues to really engage with a modern vision for information management. And then we will end up with hopefully a marriage made in heaven between people and computers. And I think really I've been trying to push this concept of the significance of this digital information. We must stop seeing computers as tools that we pick up, and we must start seeing them as partners. Human roles have been replaced with IT and digital systems, and we almost need to imagine those computer systems next to us wherever we're working, and make sure that we are using the language that they need to be able to deliver on our behalf. And you can stitch all of this together. The BIM standard does a wonderful job of this. As you can see, all those key ideas have been brought together. But really, just to finalize those key concepts then, we need that vision. We need to make it instinctive. Employees need to be talking, thinking, and acting BIM. We need to be thinking about the full life cycle of our assets. What is all the information we're going to need to be able to operate and meet our compliance and performance needs once our assets are operational? And then that idea of really identifying those information requirements, at a granular level at the beginning of any project, and then making sure that is added to the asset information model. If our data engineers aren't able to set up our model to hold that information, we're not going to have anywhere to put those requirements. And making sure that the project information is added, as said. We need to de-risk our information exchanges. We've got our specification now. We need to make sure there is careful checks to make sure we're getting what is expected and managing those standards. And then finally, that concept of the CDE, the common data environment. This is how we enable that flow of information, federating our different containers so that we get that one single version of the truth. Now, we might not be able to do it for everything at once. It might be there's only a small amount of data that is in our CDE. But over time, we can discipline, manage our data, create those rules, create those processes, and hopefully bring more and more into that common data environment through the federation of the digital estate. Ideally, automatically where we can, but if not, manual will do. So there you go. Probably a little bit over time there than I wanted to be. But I'm going to add Mike and Neil to the screen now. Neil, would you like to sort of give your perspective on this, and touching on the work that you've done, particularly with data standards, and how relevant you see and important you see this for the social housing sector?
I think it's really important to essentially get people on this journey, but it's a very, very hard journey to take, especially as an individual or an individual organisation. So I think there's a lot of kind of positive work happening in the standard space. So I see there's a comment from Chris around definitions. Everyone calls a house something different, or a maisonette something different. There's the variation creates challenges, and from a common data environment perspective, you really want to have a lot less variety to these things. So that there are some very good standards that are in place already. So there's the UK Housing Data Standards. They already essentially mentioned around the national UPRN, which Riley's referenced as well in there. So it's a really good starting point, and there's actually some quite positive work happening from HACS. It's the organisation which has essentially created them with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, an organisation called TPX Impact. We're lucky to be involved in that piece, but it's really to try and, rather than everyone trying to solve the problem themselves, because it's very, very difficult to work all these things out yourselves. There are technical constraints with systems, there are limitations around how much resources, how much capability you have in different areas. So actually, it's very much about working together, working collaboratively with lots of different providers of social.
Into that common data environment through the federation of the digital estate. Ideally, automatically where we can, but if not, manual will do. So there you go. Probably a little bit over time there than I wanted to be, but I'm going to add Mike and Neil to the screen now. Neil, would you like to sort of give your perspective on this and touching on the work that you've done, particularly with data standards, and how relevant you see and important you see this for the social housing sector?
I think it's really important to essentially get people on this journey, but it's a very, very hard journey to take, especially as an individual or an individual organisation. So I think there's a lot of kind of positive work happening in the standard space. So I see there's a comment from Chris around definitions. Everyone calls a house something different, or a maisonette something different. There's the variation creates challenges, and from a common data environment perspective, you really want to have a lot less variety to these things. So that there are some very good standards that are in place already. So there's the UK housing data standards. They already essentially mentioned around the national UPRN, which Riley's referenced as well in there. So it's a really good starting point, and there's actually some quite positive work happening from HACS. It's the organisation which has essentially created them with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, an organisation called TPX Impact. We're lucky to be involved in that piece, but it's really to try and, rather than everyone trying to solve the problem themselves, because it's very, very difficult to work all these things out yourselves. There are technical constraints with systems, there are limitations around how much resources, how much capability you have in different areas. So actually, it's very much about working together, working collaboratively with lots of different providers of social housing, just working as a kind of common team as well. But we'll already help the kind of the BIM vision become realised. You're muted, Edward.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask Mike if you could just provide some responses to that. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things you go over are the key building blocks for this. So a lot of people, rushing into trying to read some of the guides, building complex things, thinking that they do need to jump into systems where, like you say, it is, it's architecture, naming conventions, understanding where things are, what you do have. So I mean, there are a few comments that link to this. So it's things like data is key. So some organisations don't have UPRNs. I think a lot of housing associations really struggle with generating new UPRNs and the hierarchy. So splitting blocks from estate to building to units. It's understanding all that data first. So getting that right. And like you say, it's that culture element of it. So everyone has to feed into it. Everyone needs to know their touch points. So for me, it is really a big culture change. And then continuously going through that messaging to make sure that people do pick it up. The technology side of it is potentially a little bit of a misnomer in terms of people think, oh, we've paid a load of money, it will do it for us now, whereas it is quite a lot of process and people involvement.
And Mike, where have you experienced in the work that you do, which is obviously needs a lot of very accurate information for the fire safety aspect? How have these sort of issues affected you? And do you think this is part of the solution, these BIM concepts?
Yeah, BIM's definitely the way forward. I think for us, certainly going through a merger where we've got separate systems, where it's been quite difficult to give us dual access to things. So where you're kind of blind to half of the business, that's a major impact and kind of flies in the face of what BIM is trying to achieve. So while you're trying to land BIM whilst integrating systems, that's a major problem. I mean, I've worked for housing associations all over the country in the capacity of a contractor, and sort of doing surveys saying this block needs to be split into two, this block needs to be merged into one, and they basically say we can't do that. But is that I can't deliver you a report to drop in against that building if you don't have a place for it to go. So in terms of automation, if you don't have somewhere for things to land with the naming convention, it can't happen. So I think a big risk through the integration is that we are renaming some of our UPRNs, and we need to have a really, really robust process of pausing, so that if there's anything in flight with the old UPRN, if that got dropped into a system, it wouldn't go anywhere. It would just fall into oblivion. So we need to make sure that if you do any of these reconciliations, anything in flight is paused, make sure the naming's working, things like that. So there are complexities as you move through trying to fix all your data as well.
Thanks, Mike. And I can certainly say from my from a compliance angle, I have to maintain a thing called the asset and liability register. So I'm sort of doing a health check on all these core bits of data, and and also the regulatory returns. And so often there's not even complete clarity around the properties that are in our ownership, because the structures are highly complex. There are issues with managing agents that have got responsibilities, but lack of clarity about which have got managing agents and what the precise responsibilities of the managing agents are. And some of those responsibilities are hugely important in terms of who's doing the compliance checks on it. Not to mention also financial, how much do I owe this managing agent? So there's a whole host of things that can't happen. And I think haven't been fully gripped yet, which will be significantly impacting on the sector and massively undermining efficiency and effectiveness, because people are chasing their tails for hours, if not days and weeks on end, trying to get the answers to many of these questions. Mike, Neil, thank you for that. Now, there's been some questions that have come in. So, Mike, would you like to potentially put some of those on screen for us to take a look at?
Okay, so is this just clicking on the show?
Yeah, whichever one you think we should perhaps discuss. Folks, you can still put your questions in now if you'd like to, and we can discuss them here.
So we've got, from Lisa Kearns, agree, accurate, up-to-date data sets are key, but the main challenge is keeping them updated throughout the year. In most cases, this is done manually, which is time-consuming. So I think, anything where you need to update it, it's not a new report coming in, it's not automated, so it's getting that sort of mentality to keep things updated. So I think that is a really good point.
So is it worth discussing that a little bit? Neil, do you have anything to say on that? Yeah,
I think there is a lot of opportunity around effective data to be really, really smart with how you do it. I was speaking with a housing leader a couple of months ago who said we're missing information, so their response was to basically send somebody out to basically go and gather all the information around the properties. And it took them about 6 months to gather all the information. And I tried to be as polite as I could, but all the information they wanted to gather was actually already available in the public domain or behind paywalls. So they essentially could have done the entire project in probably about a day, rather than 6 months, for a fraction of the cost. And it's really, there's so many pressures in the sector that it's not having the time to really explore these things to work out what is the art of possible, because it's not necessarily, you don't need to go and get it yourself. there's actually information that someone's already curated, like Ordnance Survey, Land Registry. You can buy it. You don't need to go and do it yourself. It's a lot easier. And I think that's a real important gear shift that's required in people's thinking.
And of course, if you've adopted a social housing data standard, for example, then that because let's face it, there's so many ways of defining the same information. But if we've sort of got that interoperable data standard, then it makes it even easier to pull in those data sets. The other thing I would say, Lisa, is that if we don't really grip our data and we don't define it like this, it's almost impossible to automate it. So these sort of concepts that we have to do have to be, implemented for us to then have automated solutions. So sort of disciplining our data as the concept set out is the step to being able to then get to automation, having automatic reminders, maybe from CRM, oh, this is now at its due date, now this needs a review or something like that. Mike, back to you.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point. So Chris talks about the golden thread. So this is where most people in building safety are getting this BIM idea from. Information is only good on day one. So when you have leaseholders over 6 months and longer period, you may as well rip up that information. So behind locked doors, we no longer know what's going on with certainly with leaseholders.
So this is sort of coming back to this point of keeping information current, isn't it? My view, what I see, a lot of that missing data that I see is a lack of ownership data, lack of managing agent information. These are things that are often written on legal documents, on leases, on titles and things like that, or on contracts. And they've never made their way off that paper-based document, which is, the old-fashioned way of doing things, into a structured database. They've never had their place created in the asset information model, which can then be federated and automated. So it's about, was there consideration, when we first decided we were going to take on leaseholders, did we think, oh, we're going to need to know all this about the leaseholder, we're going to need to check it and update it and maintain it. So what are my requirements around leaseholders? Now let me make sure my asset information model has actually got a place for that information to be put in that database. And then now for our federation strategy and our processes, let's have a way of automating that, having reminders and so forth. Mike, Neil, anything to add on that?
Do you want to go first, Mike?
No, I agree. I think there's a comment I'll put on screen which I think kind of leads into that. So I'll leave it there, and I can share it now if Neil wants to comment. It's quite a big one. But again, it's sort of talking about everyone collaborating, working together can try and get to like a standardization of how we tackle this. So I think, there are some of the guidances and the British standards and ISOs and things like that, but it's quite complex. So I think it's kind of putting people off, feels more technical than it really needs to be. So it is kind of, Mike Gaskell says, in his view, it means that what is required will be the best way to achieve what he describes as a whole sector. So just working together, collaborating. I think there's a lot more collaboration going on between housing associations. We're no longer in a football league against each other. We're all trying to achieve the same thing. So I think there's a lot of discussion happening now.
So Neil, let's just pick up on that. So Mike, I think Mike's talking about having, like a housing system that just does everything. So it does your compliance, it does your tenancy management, it does your asset management, etc. What's your take on that?
So I completely agree that you should seek to standardise these things, because many of the processes are the same. If you're doing fire risk assessments, there are different types, but actually ultimately you're working in the same legal framework in the different area. The buildings will be different, the people going out will be different, but the reason for having different processes, different tech, doesn't make a huge amount of sense. If everyone's doing it in the same way, you can get better economies of scale. I think that the idea of kind of working together on technology, there's an initiative called the Open Data Exchange. It's about trying to build a national database of social housing. That's a really kind of good starting point around having a single place to look at all property, and you kind of work back. So here's a common data environment vision at the very, very top level. not necessarily granular in terms of components and the nuances around it, but there are initiatives in this space trying to work on building this out.
And Neil, could you just, in terms of having one piece of software that can do everything versus actually having one data standard which standardizes everything, can you just reflect on that? You know, there's the tech side, but then there's also actually having one standard for data.
Mm-hmm. So standard for data would essentially be, this is a property, this is the type of property it is, it's a house, this is the associated information like the metadata, such as it's a 3-bedroom house, it's got a living room, it's this construction, it was built in this year, and you're building that out. Now the system is basically the place you want to put that in. Now, because you've got such a level of complexity in housing and the regulation keeps changing, you don't really have the opportunity for a single vendor to have a kind of all singing, all dancing piece of software that does everything across all needs, because you've got geospatial information, you've got BIM, which is much more spatial in terms of how it works. You've got sensors providing connections via like wireless integrations, providing lots of continuous detection information. So there's lots of stuff constantly happening and evolving. And there's quite a lot of technical debt around software vendors. So they can't just completely shift into this brand new world. It takes a huge amount of time and energy. And by the time that you've shifted into one part, another part's degraded. So actually, it would be great to have a single system which did everything for everybody. But I think given the incumbents and the kind of price tag to create such a thing, I think it's something you've got to start small with.
And actually, perhaps it's about having clear data standard, which the software companies then work to. So they then sell their product based on it can work to the social housing data standard. Absolutely, you can essentially build out processes and your information requirements around the data standards. So there's nothing to stop any of the software developers or software vendors actually just using that kind of off the bat. And there's a few that are in conversations with HACT and with the ministry around wanting to move that direction. So I think there's quite a lot of positive steps in that direction. But as always with these things, it's a longer term play, and you've got to have that continuous focus to make it happen. But it comes down to providers as well. If you're buying a new system, in your procurement, say it's got to be compatible with the UK Housing Data Standards from HACT. Put that as a requirement. And if that's a requirement, it makes your life a lot easier. And then actually, you make the standards better, and you make it a lot easier for everyone's tools to be almost pre-configured for them. Yeah, and of course, it doesn't get away from the work that the organisation has to do to put these disciplines and key concepts into play. Mm-hmm. Mike, any other questions that you'd like to pull out?
I don't know if this is a little bit left field. One interesting comment from Chris. So, BIM information is more than just the buildings. So, customer information as well. Understand how our customers live in their homes. With the change to working from home, has anyone calculated the impact on blocks with much more additional usage, different cultures with higher occupancy? So I don't know if that is something for BIM and the AI conversation, things like that, but do we know how buildings will react to being used differently going forward?
Do you want me to go that one?
Yeah, go for it now, please.
So that there is some work. I think it's the Greater London Authority has been looking at damp and mold detection in London councils. So there is some looking at how do you monitor that kind of over time. And I think this is really around how you gather the information. I think there might be some studies, but I would envision there's nothing holistic. But what you've essentially got to do is make the blocks connected to the internet. So you've got to put kind of Wi-Fi into the blocks, so sensors can transfer the data. Of course, you've got to build up a warehouse or a place for the information to go, and then you've got to be able to run the reports and understand what's happening with the information. So I think some good examples I've seen tactically are door sensors. So you can put a sensor on every single door in a block, and then you can see which are the high volume usage doors, which ones are the lower volume usage doors. So instead of replacing every single door in a block, you say these 10 doors are getting used 500 times a day, these 20 doors are getting used 5 times a week. So actually, the 5 times a week ones, we can leave in there for 10 years. We're not that worried. The ones with the high volume, maybe it's every 2 years. We just need to go in and chop and change them quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Yeah, I think our homes are going to become ever more interconnected. I mean, we have a thing called Switchy, which is monitoring humidity and temperature, which is trying to keep people safe from fuel poverty and damp and mold. And that's just one example. And I think as we go to a net zero future, we're going to be measuring how fuel efficient, energy efficient our homes are as well. So we're actually going towards that Internet of Things, and we're going to get increasing amounts of information. We're going to get live data feeds. And we really will. I mean, people talk about digital twins, where you've actually almost got a digital version of your home and you can sort of tell everything that's going on about it. And again, to manage these ever increasing amounts of information, you're going to need BIM. Mike, any more you want to pull out?
I think they're the main ones. I think there's a little bit of conversation now, agreeing with clearer data standards. Everyone moving towards a shared view of what a data standard should be. People would like there to be a one-stop shop system, but the practicalities, we think, wouldn't allow that to happen in the near future. So, yeah, I mean, and I agree with that. I think it is kind of there. I think everyone's probably going to move to the same place. It's just how long it takes us to get there. The guidance from the government, kind of the specifics are quite vague, and the things you want to know aren't there. So you want to say, just tell us, just say, do it like this, and people will do it like that, and you have this amount of time to get there. I think people feel a bit more comfortable with just some firm guidance on what's the expectation, rather than figure out yourselves, vaguely what you need to achieve. Should just be, there you go. Everyone work towards this in the next 5 years, and then we're on the same page.
Yeah, and no doubt the government will be afraid of pushback. But I think once organisations realise that they can't really grip their data unless they do this, they are forever going to be struggling. They're not going to be able to automate processes. Remember, if we go back to where my presentation started, we need to get more efficient. We need to do more with less. Well, computers do what humans do in seconds when it comes to information. We need to be able to automate ruthlessly whatever we can. Keep the humans for the bits that computers can't do. And so really, if we are going to sort of become modern and efficient and deliver value for money as the regulatory standard requires, we do need to actually go to this granular level of definition. And then those data standards are really going to come into their own, because people are going to realise there's a lot of work to do. Actually, I've got a data standard that helps me to define all this stuff. One point I wanted to pick up was from Rowley. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly there, where he says this all touches on the Building Safety Act, the golden thread of migration into operations. Absolutely does. Yeah, I think it was actually was it the Hackett review, I think it was, that came before the Building Safety Act, which is talking about the golden thread. And it's very much hinting at that. And actually there's aspects of the Building Safety Act which is sort of requiring you to start picking up aspects of BIM. Public service buildings have actually been required to apply BIM now for several years, because the government recognises it's a huge win. You minimise waste, you're more efficient, you get a better outcomes. Everything gets better when you have that lovely information management BIM culture. Collaboration becomes easier, opportunities open up. So it is absolutely very closely linked to the Building Safety Act. Now, I thought also potentially we could just maybe talk a little bit more about AI and the role that AI has got in information management in social housing. Neil, have you got any thoughts on that you'd like to raise here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some really interesting things happening around trying to do things like predictive analytics around what steps should we take around different transactions. But what I've been working on as well is trying to help people adopt the standards more easily around the hack data standards. So we've built a machine learning algorithm to match everyone's data straight, like really quickly against the standards. So I think it's just really trying to find out what are the opportunities for these tactical and strategic tools. But you've got to think about what is the end point. What do we want to achieve? It's all kind of well and good thinking of we want to rush off into AI because it's the buzzword, it's the zeitgeist, it's really exciting. But what are you wanting to achieve? Is AI the correct tool? Because AI is big. There's lots to it, but large language models have really helped kind of lower the curve around who can access AI, which is really good. But you've got to think about your end goals really with using it.
And do you think we can get away from the sort of discipline that BIM's pointing to by using AI, or are the BIM concepts a requirement regardless?
I think you're going to have AI to do different bits, like the measurement of like sensor information is going to be a continuous feed of information. So you can essentially have AI telling you what to do. As that becomes more sophisticated, you have more sensors on your buildings. You can essentially work out what's happening almost real time, and then that will give you a good indication. But it won't necessarily tell you what the building's made of. You would need to go and do like a different type of survey. You could build tools that use AI to do those sorts of things, but it's going to be very much like a jigsaw. You can have bits working different ways. But it's really kind of holding on to that kind of common data environment vision. How do we want to work? What's the end output we're looking at? And what are the steps to take? And AI, and in all of its forms, is one of the tools that should be considered.
Neil, thank you for that. And I think we've pretty much run out of time. So thank you to everyone who's provided us questions. And then there are a couple of poll questions that I want to put out there. Actually, Neil,